Now that we have a better understanding of what insights are and how we can formulate insights and evaluate them, it's also important for us to know that there are different levels of reflection, and therefore there are different types of insights. The point here is not that we have to engage in all levels of reflection all the time, or that we should prepare all three types of insights. The point here is that it's important for us to see the repertoire of possibilities so that we can pick and choose what we'd like to aim for in our classes. So the first type of insight and the first level of reflection I would call personal. These are personal insights. So these are insights about life, about the world, or even about God. So this would be the spiritual and moral application of the lesson that I was talking to you about previously. So what happens here is we relate what we have learned to our personal life, discovering its relevance, its significance or value, especially its implications on the world, on our lives, and God. So the question that's being asked here is, why did I learn this? What for? Or what difference does it make now that I've learned this? So in trying to answer these questions, we might be able to craft a personal insight. Here's an example. This example is from physical education, and the topic is the benefits of fitness. So one example would be, there is a relationship between physical fitness and self-esteem. This statement qualifies as an insight based on our three criteria because it's debatable, defensible, and also deep diveable. But it's a personal insight. It's the first type of insight because it deals with life and the world, and in this particular case, the self. So the more I get into physical fitness, the better I will feel about myself, the higher will be my self-esteem. So it's a personal insight. Here's another example, this time from science. The topic is biological evolution, and there are two possible insights here. The first is the theory of evolution does not eliminate the possibility of a creator. It's obviously controversial, it's intriguing, it will breed a lot of conversations, even arguments, but it's a claim. It's not just an opinion, it's a claim. It can be defended. There can be a reasonable discourse surrounding this claim that the theory of evolution does not eliminate the possibility of a creator. Clearly, there's no consensus as far as this matter is concerned. So this is actually quite debatable, but at the same time defensible, and it invites a deeper dive into evolution as well as maybe theology. Another formulation for this is God works no less actively through the laws of nature. Again, a judgment that can be debated, that can be defended, that leads to a deeper dive. The point I'm trying to make here is that these two proposed insights are examples from science, but they are personal insights. They're implications about one's belief in God. And in this particular case, it's not artificial, it's not forced, because it's natural for people to think about the implication of Darwin's theory on one's beliefs, on one's religious beliefs. The second type of insight is called conceptual insights, and what we do on this level of reflection here is that we connect the concepts and facts that we have learned to other ideas from the same class or other classes, and we build a framework that allows us to organize different ideas and to synthesize them. So the question we're trying to answer here is, what did I learn? If in the personal insight, the personal level of reflection, the question that we're focused on is, why did I learn this? What for? What difference does it make? Here it's simply, what did I learn? But the answer is not supposed to be just a recall of the knowledge and skills, but some kind of synthesis where the ideas, the concepts, and the facts are interconnected to form a greater whole, a bigger picture. Here's an example using the same topic of biological evolution from a science class. The survival of a species is determined not only by competition, but also by cooperation. So this statement is not an obvious fact because it also raises questions about the usual cliched notion about biological evolution, about Darwin's theory. There's a claim being made here, which is not merely a random opinion, that the survival of a species is just as dependent on cooperation among species as much as competition between them. So this is a kind of synthesis. It helps organize all the things that you learn about the theory of evolution. Here's another example of a conceptual insight. If you engage on the conceptual level of reflection and the topic is bodies of water from a geography class, I'm using an example here about the Philippines, this is a possible insight. The islands of the Philippines are more connected than separated by its bodies of water. Very deep diveable. It really invites more learning. It invites more research. Is this really true? So it's a thesis statement that you can actually prove or disprove using what you've learned from the topic on bodies of water in your geography class. So this would be another example of a conceptual insight. So far we have personal insights about life, about the world, about God, about the self. And now we also have conceptual insights about just what we've learned, the concepts and the facts and their connections. Let's go to the third type. The third type is called metacognitive insights. And these insights, this level of reflection, is really more about the learning process, the thinking and the type of knowing that went on. The question we're trying to reflect on here is, how did I learn? So you can ask follow-up questions like, what got in the way? What facilitated the learning? And also, in what ways did I think? So on this level of reflection, on the metacognitive level of reflection, we're trying to understand the learning process and the ways of thinking considered valuable in the discipline. So this metacognitive type of reflection gives us insights into the discipline itself, as well as the process that we went through when we were trying to learn the matter at hand. So here's an example. This example is from literature. Let's say the topic is text structure. So a metacognitive insight could sound something like this. Understanding a text structure helps us better interpret its meaning. So this is a claim about how interpretation works, how literary interpretation happens. If you want to engage in good literary interpretation, in competent literary interpretation, you must bear in mind that you need to understand the structure of the text. Your understanding of the structure of the text will actually facilitate the interpretation of the meaning of the text. So this is a metacognitive insight because it gives us an insight into the discipline, into literary interpretation, how that works, how we can engage in competent interpretation of a text. This particular example is from science. It's on the topic of climate change. Let me read to you the insight. Scientific theories are most educated guesses based on all available data and theories available thus far. Now, this is a metacognitive insight because the topic is climate change, but it's not just limited or focused on climate change. It's about the whole scientific enterprise. How does science work? How do we formulate theories? Now, note that this is a metacognitive insight. It's neither a personal insight nor a conceptual insight. If it were a personal insight, the statement should be about the implications of climate change in my life, in the world, and so on and so forth. If it were a conceptual insight, it would be more about the connections of the concepts and facts in climate change. So this is more about the discipline. This is about how science works. So it's a metacognitive insight. So here are the three levels of reflection that yield three different types of insights. In summary, we have personal insights, which are statements about life, about the world, about the self and God. These are statements that answer the question, why have I learned this? What for? What difference does it make in my life or in the world? The second level of reflection is conceptual, yielding the type of insight that we're calling conceptual. This is really about the connections and organization of the concepts and facts that lead to a bigger picture, a synthesis statement. And finally, we have metacognitive insights, which are more about learning and the ways of thinking in a particular discipline. Now, the point that we're trying to make here is not that the teacher must cover all three types of reflection and insights. We're just trying to show you the repertoire of possible levels of reflection and insights. You can just pick one. Pick whatever you think is going to be most helpful or most interesting or most suitable for the class. I'd like to share with you some more examples of insights, and I hope that these examples will clarify what insights are all about and will help you formulate your own. Here are a couple of examples from language. The first one is a metacognitive insight. It's about writing. This actually comes from my writing professor back in college. I never forgot what she said when she told the class, write in white heat, but edit in cold blood. It's a great quote. It talks about the secret in writing, that we shouldn't agonize over every single word and sentence first. Just create that monster, write in white heat, and then edit in cold blood. Now, this is debatable, this is defensible, it's deep diveable, but at the same time, it's about writing. It's about the craft of writing. So it's a metacognitive insight. The second example is a quote from Orwell from the book 1984. It's a personal insight, and it talks about language, what language is. And it's another great quote. Language serves as a means of human expression as well as a tool of oppression. These two insights are great examples of insights in terms of inviting a deeper dive, because you want to know more about writing, you want to learn more about language given these two statements. The next example is from business. There are two examples. The first is business has a responsibility not only to its shareholders but also to all its stakeholders. And the second example is the customer is not always right. Customers don't always know what is best for them. Business has a responsibility to educate its customers. Now, these are very controversial claims, and they're very provocative in terms of reflection, in terms of discussion. So I think a teacher could actually have a field day having a discussion or reflection sessions about these two insights. The next example is again from history, and it's a metacognitive example. Doing history means crafting the soundest possible interpretation given sometimes conflicting and incomplete data. I think this is a great insight because it really tells us what historians do. Historians don't just read history books that have dropped down from heaven, as we know. They're interpreting the data, but data are often conflicting and also incomplete. But the job of the historian is to come up with the soundest possible interpretation despite all these constraints. So this really gives an understanding of what doing history means. It's an excellent example of a metacognitive insight. Here's an example from statistics. It's also a metacognitive insight. Determining which statistics to compare, which representations to use, and what the results of a comparison might mean depends on the question being investigated. Again, let me read that again. Determining which statistics to compare, which representations to use, and what the results of comparison might mean depends on the question being investigated. It's a metacognitive statement because it provides a guideline on how you should make sense of statistics, how you should use statistics. It's all about the question, the research question. The research question is what determines which statistics to use and how you're going to use them and how you're going to interpret them. Another metacognitive example from literature, a very interesting one. Literature is both a window to another world as well as a mirror that reflects the world of the reader. It's a very provocative insight because it tells us that if we read literature, we could learn about another world and enter into that world, for example, Harry Potter's world. But even as we're reading the book and learning about this other world, we may also be learning about our world. The Harry Potter books are about this magical world of wizards, but it's also about good and evil. It's also about envy. It's also about oppression. It's also about diversity, about prejudice. So a piece of literature is very well a window to another world, but it also tells us about our own world. It's a metacognitive insight because it tells us what literature does or what the reader does when the reader engages in literary interpretation. Here's an example from media studies. All media messages are constructed They always have a perspective and may occasionally have a purpose. It's a conceptual insight because it tells us about media messages in general. Arguably, it could also be a metacognitive insight because it can guide us on how we interpret media messages. So as you can see, there are overlaps in the three types of insights and the three levels of reflection. So in summary, we have three levels of reflection that deal to three types of insights: personal insights, conceptual insights, and metacognitive insights. And we find out which one they are depending on the question they're trying to answer and their focus. Whether they're focused about the implications of what has been learned in one's life or in the world, whether it's a question of just sort of synthesizing and organizing and connecting the concepts and facts, or if it's more about the discipline, about the learning process and the ways of thinking and knowing in that discipline. What's important here is regardless of the type of insights you formulate and prepare for class, they must meet the three criteria. They must be debatable, they must be defensible, and they must be deep diveable. Because only when they're able to meet these criteria are they going to be conducive for reflection. Are they going to encourage reflection? Are they going to provoke reflection among our learners, which is what we want to do? So the learner is the meaning maker, and the teacher cannot make the learner make meaning. The most the teacher can do is to be an effective facilitator of reflection. And we've already said that the very first and most necessary step is for the teacher to plan and prepare the reflection. So here are some tips that I'd like to just share with you as a summary also of some of the things we've talked about. The first tip is, unless you plan and prepare for reflection, it most likely won't happen. Sometimes it happens by accident or by grace or by good fortune. But unless the teacher plans and prepares for reflection, it probably won't happen. So it's important for teachers to make the preparations. Next, include your proposed insight among your desired learning outcomes. So the teacher should formulate some possible insights, no? And include those insights among the desired learning outcomes because as we know, the desired learning outcomes are what guide the teacher in designing the class. So if the insight is not part of the desired learning outcome, the teacher might forget about it. So the teacher prepares by formulating one or two insights that are explicitly included in the desired learning outcomes, but the teacher must also be open to the students' insights. It's possible that students' insights might be different from what you've prepared, but they might be just as valuable and relevant, if not more so. Remember, you are not going to spoon feed your students the insights. You're supposed to formulate the reflection questions, which we'll discuss later. So you're not going to state your insight. So it's very possible your students might come up with other insights in response to your reflection questions. So be open to these insights, even if they're different from yours. Maybe they're better formulated, so you can actually use them for future classes. Or maybe they're totally different insights, but are just as valuable and relevant. This is a very important tip. The teacher must provide the needed time and scaffold to enable students to engage in reflection. If we don't carve out the time for our students to reflect, if we don't give them time to reflect, if we don't create the opportunities for them to reflect, they probably won't do it because people are just so busy in general. If we don't provide a scaffold, if we don't provide a structure or a guide for them to reflect, if we don't come up with a question and we just say, what struck you or what happened there, then most probably the quality of the reflection will also be all over the place. So we have to schedule the reflection. It's important for us to schedule the reflection, but at the same time, we should be flexible and open to unforeseen opportunities. It's very possible that I'm not exactly expecting us to go into reflection right now, but one of you, for some reason, has a question that can breed reflections and insights. So a teacher must not be so attached to the plans made beforehand and to the insights already formulated that the class will miss out on this wonderful opportunity, on this wonderful teaching moment. Next tip, plan different forms of reflection depending on what you consider helpful. So there are many different ways of reflecting. Think time, the teacher can just pause in class or cut up the lecture and as I've done and ask you questions. You can think about this individually, or if it's possible, students can pair share. They can talk to their seatmate and just discuss a question briefly or casually. Or you could actually ask the students to do something more formal, a full-blown activity like a journal, a blog, or even a video blog. Or you can have a small group discussion in your class as well. So there are many different forms of reflection. It doesn't have to be individual, contemplative type all the time. Now, here's an important and often neglected practice. No? If for us reflection is important, if insight is important, if understanding is important, we must try to assess it. We have to assess understanding. But when I say assess, when I say design an assessment for the insight, I don't just mean formal and graded assessments. I don't just mean summative assessments. It's possible to have an informal assessment. You can assess understanding by just having a discussion with a class to check if they understand the insight that came up in the discussion. So it can be summative assessment, formative assessment, it can be graded, ungraded, whatever. The important thing is that we assess. And the reason for that is that we measure what we treasure. If we treasure reflection, if we treasure understanding, if we treasure insights, then we should go out of our way to assess it, even if it's not graded or formal. Let's not just measure what is easy to measure. Let's not just design tests that are easy to design, correct, or score. That's very understandable for teachers because teachers are very busy. But if we want to be really Ignatian and really send the signal to our students that we value reflection, then we have to define and measure the significant desired learning outcomes, which should include the insights, because the insights are the fruit of the reflection. Now, ideally, we should design reflection for every unit, but not for every session. So I've talked to some practitioners before, and they were saying, it's so hard, it's so difficult, it's impossible to have a reflection for every session. Well, here's some good news. You don't have to. As long as you've formulated an insight for one unit or one topic, and you're ready to use that insight to conduct or facilitate reflection, then I think that's good enough. Here's another tip. Consider formulating overarching insights and interdisciplinary insights. What do I mean by overarching insights? By overarching insights, I'm talking about the insights that tend to recur because there are big ideas in your discipline or in your topics. So the example we had earlier was about history, how history is a source of lessons for the present so that we will have a better future. So that is that's an overarching insight that recurs in, I guess, all history classes, hopefully. No? But also, if you have overarching insights, you are better able to go interdisciplinary. No? For example, the metacognitive insight on history as being the soundest possible interpretation, in a way that's very similar to theory formulation in science. Science is also coming up with the soundest possible interpretation of all the conflicting and incomplete data available. So if the teacher of history and the teacher of science would like to collaborate, one basis for the collaboration would be this overarching interdisciplinary insight. Next tip, and very important tip, ask the right questions. Again, as I said earlier, we're not here to spoon feed the students. We're not here to tell them what the insight is. We're not going to force our insight on them. We have to formulate reflection questions. We have to learn how to ask the right questions so that hopefully, maybe, they might reach the same insight as we have prepared. But as we said earlier, it's very possible that they may come up with their own insight, and that's just fine. So here are some guidelines for formulating reflection questions. They're very similar to formulating insights. The reflection questions must be debatable. It should be an open-ended question. There should be no single correct answer or solution that is obvious or verifiable. Okay, so it should be an open-ended question so that it can provoke debate, it can provoke thought and talk. The question should lead to answers that are defensible. It should require a judgment. It should not just require an opinion. For example, what's your favorite color? Obviously, it will not require a judgment. That's just an opinion. Or what's your favorite planet in the solar system? That's just going to lead to an opinion, and the answers are not going to be defensible. So the question must be formulated in such a way that it doesn't yield a fact or an opinion, but a defensible claim. And of course, the primary goal of formulating an effective reflection question is to provoke a deep dive. It should be deep diveable. It should provoke further thought. So it should be interesting and controversial, and it should lead to more curiosity and greater learning. So here are some examples of reflection questions for insights. This one is from a science class. It's a metacognitive insight. Scientific theories are tested ways of making sense of the available data, but are open to revision, fine-tuning, and correction. So that's the proposed insight. What could the question sound like? The question could be, what does Darwin's theory tell us about scientific theories, how they are developed, formulated, and tested? So note that it's an open-ended question, and hopefully it provokes reflection that will lead to this particular metacognitive insight. So it's not just a generic question about what happened there, or what struck you, or how did you feel. It's a carefully formulated question because the hope is the students will stumble over the proposed insight. Another example on the same topic, biological evolution. This time it's a conceptual insight. In biological evolution, form follows function because natural selection allows for the more advantageous traits of a species to be passed on to the next generation. So what could a reflection question sound like for this insight? In what way does Darwin's theory of evolution help us understand how nature is designed? So again, note that the question is rather focused and hopefully will lead more to the target insight. The final example from the same topic, the same lesson of biological evolution, this time it's a personal insight. Darwin's theory of the evolution of species does not eliminate the possibility of a creator. For believers, the theory pertains more to a possible process of creation. So a possible reflection question for this would be, would the theory of biological evolution have some impact on your faith, specifically our belief in creation and in God? If so, how? So what I'd like you to do is evaluate the sample reflection questions that I've come up with to ask yourself, are they debatable? Are they defensible? Are they deep diveable? So these criteria are used to formulate effective reflection questions, but just like the insights, the criteria we use for the insights, they're also used for evaluating the reflection questions. So I hope you learned something when you're trying to evaluate the sample reflection questions using the 3 criteria that I've suggested. If you have any questions, I hope you will raise them and also share any comments that you might have. Here are 3 design questions that you may want to consider if you want to embed reflection in your classes. Number 1, what reflection questions should students be thinking about in this unit? So at the outset, you're already thinking about the reflection question. If you have a target insight already in mind, if you've already formulated a possible insight, that's a good time to already formulate the reflection question. Second, what overarching reflection questions should they be wrestling with throughout their education, especially in terms of the course that you're teaching, the subject area you're teaching? So don't just think for the particular unit, think also for the continuing education of the student. What are the overarching reflection questions and insights? And finally, what insights could they possibly arrive at as a result of reflecting on these questions? So these are 3 design questions that hopefully can guide you in preparing for facilitating reflection in your class. So just a few words about overarching insights. An overarching insight underlies, connects, and organizes most, if not all, of the other insights in the course. So they're really important because they're the fundamental insights. And as I said earlier, overarching insights recur in one's education. They get more developed, they get more nuanced, they get more sophisticated, but they can also be used to connect to other disciplines. So here's an example of a conceptual overarching insight. Design follows function. It's an overarching insight because this insight is not limited only to anatomy, for example. It can also be used in botany, zoology, and other topics in science. It can also be used in other subject matters, in other disciplines, in architecture, in engineering, any other design subject. Here's an example of an overarching metacognitive insight. History is always interpretation, always with a perspective, often with an agenda, and thus requiring thoughtful evaluation. It's an overarching insight because we want our students to understand this. As they go from the first grade all the way to high school, even the university, we want them to appreciate what history is asking them to do. History is interpretation, but it's also evaluation. Here's an example of an overarching personal insight that may be used in religious education, especially in Jesuit schools and universities. The statement goes, "For the believer, God can be found in all things." So it's possible that if you subscribe to Ignatian spirituality, finding God in all things for you is a virtual fact. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in a religious education class, it's actually pedagogically effective to propose it as a claim, as a theory, as an insight that students can debate about, that students can reflect about, that students can evaluate and check whether it's true in their own lives. So an overarching insight underlies, connects, and organizes most, if not all, of the other insights. So here's a question for you. What difference do you think would an overarching insight make in the way a course is designed? So let's say you're teaching one class. And usually when we prepare for a class, we have our syllabus, we have all the topics that we need to cover. Usually our classes are topic-driven or content-driven. But what if our classes were reflection-driven? What if you had an overarching insight already in mind as you're designing your class? What difference would it make? Can we take a pause and think about that for a while? So what difference would an overarching insight make in the way a course is designed? I hope you had a chance to think about it, but here's my answer. If you have an overarching insight as you're designing a course, as you're preparing for a class, it gives you greater focus. It helps you prioritize content. Now, that's a very important benefit because the problem of most teachers is that there's just too much content and there's hardly time to cover all the content. If you have an overarching insight, it will help you focus on the content that's more relevant to that insight, the content that's going to promote learning and understanding that insight. At the same time, the greater focus brought about by having an overarching insight is that it will guide you in designing the learning task. So let's look at an example here. Let's say you're teaching a class in history, and the overarching insight that you've come up with is something like this. History is always interpretation, always with a perspective, often with an agenda, and thus requiring thoughtful evaluation. Let's say you're given free hand in choosing what content you're going to cover in this history class, in this contemporary history class. Well, if this is your insight, you would pick the content that's going to promote understanding of this insight. So one possibility is, for example, to choose a lesson on the stolen generation, the Aboriginal children in Australia, because the accounts of those events have been rather contested. You have on the one hand the official account of what happened there, but also you have on the other hand all this oral tradition of the interpretation of those events. So picking a contested interpretation like the story of the stolen generations in Australia would help promote an understanding of this insight. At the same time, when you're designing the learning task, instead of just showing them a film, an official report on the history of the stolen generations, what went on there, what you could do is actually give them alternative versions of the same event. And instead of telling them which one you would like, you can actually ask the students to be the ones to decide which ones they feel are more accurate. So in a way, the choice of the content and the design of the learning experiences will contribute to reaching this overarching insight of history being always interpretation, your choice of the content of the topics, as well as your design of the learning experience of the students will actually help promote this particular overarching insight, focusing on the interpretive nature of history. So if you already have a clear overarching insight in mind, it's really going to help you prioritize your content and also guide you in designing the learning tasks that you will assign to your students. So in summary, here are 3 big tips about designing reflection in Ignatian Pedagogy. The first is we need to design it. We need to scaffold it. Otherwise, it won't happen. Second, we need to teach it, and we also need to model it in our class, because very few people know how to reflect, very few engage in the habit of reflection. So it's important for us to model it as a teacher. So finally, we need to aim for it and test it, which means we need to include it explicitly in our desired learning outcome, and we should not forget to assess it, whether formally or informally. So we've spent a lot of time talking about reflection. We tried to unpack Ignatian reflection. We tried to scaffold how we can design a reflection for our classes. We came up with criteria for formulating insights and for evaluating insights, for formulating reflection questions. I hope all of these have served to clarify for you what reflection is and how reflection can help us establish greater learner engagement.